The Edmund Fitzgerald. The Edmund Fitzgerald was built at the Great Lakes Engineering Works at River Rouge, Michigan. More than 10,000 people watched as she slid into the water on June 8, 1958, after being christened by Mrs. Edmund Fitzgerald, the wife of the president of the Northwestern Life Insurance Company. The Fitzgerald family had long been involved with Great Lakes shipping, which made the name appropriate. With a length of 729 feet and a gross tonnage of 1,000 or 13,632, she was the largest ship on the Great Lakes until 1971. She was 75 feet of beam and 39 feet deep. The construction cost in 1958 was $8.4 million, and to replace her now would likely cost roughly 10 times as much. She carried a 7,000 horsepower steam turbine capable of pushing her along at a top speed of just over 16 miles per hour, or around 14 knots. Although she was owned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee, she was under charter to the Ogilvy Norton Company of Cleveland, and the lease was to run until 1983. The Fitzgerald set some records in her career. In 1964, she became the first Great Lakes carrier to ship more than 1 million gross tons of ore through the Soo Locks, and in 1968, she topped that record by hauling 1.2 million tons. Her single trip record was 27,402 tons in 1969. Like many lake boats, she was equipped for carrying passengers, but her main function was to carry ore, and in all respects, the Fitzgerald was a conventional straight-decker Great Lakes ore carrier. She usually carried a crew of about 28, but she could comfortably carry 35. The cargo holds were located along the center of the vessel, and the ballast tanks were situated below and outboard of the holds. During her final voyage, these ballast tanks may have sustained damage. In their investigation, the Marine Board focused on possible flooding of those tanks as a contributing factor in her loss. Altogether, there were 8 ballast tanks, 2 8-inch vent pipes, which extended from each tank to the spar deck, and 2 of these vent pipes were lost in the storm during her last voyage. Her captain reported that, and at the time it seemed like a minor issue, but investigators would also focus on that later. The crew could manually measure the amount of water in the ballast tanks by using sounding tubes on the weathered deck, which would be the upper deck. And they could also obtain a sounding report from gauges in the engine room. The ballast tanks were filled and drained by 4 electric 7,000 gallon per minute pumps, backed up by 2 2,000 gallon per minute ones. But there was no means by which the crew could determine the water level in the cargo holds, and that troubled the investigators later. The forward deck house contained the crew's accommodations and pilot house, while the after deck had more crew accommodations and the mess room. Crewmen were able to travel between the 2 deck houses either across the open spar deck or through access passageways located above the cargo holds but below the open deck. There was one of these passageways on either beam. There was also a collision bulkhead located between the forepeak and the forward ballast tank, and watertight bulkheads forward and aft of the engine room. The Fitzgerald had 21 separate 11 by 48-foot cargo hatches arranged along the midsection of the ship, and below these hatches were 3 huge cargo holds separated by watertight bulkheads. Each hatch had a 24-inch high coaming surrounding the opening, and a hatch cover consisting of a single piece of 5/16-inch steel fitted with a sealing gasket. There was an electrically powered crane to manage the removal and placement of the hatches. Additional access to the cargo holds was provided by 2 small personnel hatches through the upper deck. One hatch was forward by the number 1 hold, the other aft by the number 3 hold. Doors through the watertight bulkheads gave access to the number 2 hold, which is in the middle. The pumps used to drain or fill the ballast tanks could be used to drain the number 3 hold, and the way the ship was designed, any water coming into the holds was supposed to drain aft into the number 3 hold, where it would then be pumped out. However, when the holds were filled with ore, any water would have to seep through the cargo before it could drain to the number 3 hold and then be pumped out. Many sailors familiar with these ships said that the holds could not be effectively pumped out once the ships were loaded, because that cargo tended to block the passage of the water. The Edmund Fitzgerald remained virtually unchanged from the time she was launched in 1958 until 1969, when a diesel bow thruster was installed. This was a recent development in lake shipping at the time and designed to improve maneuverability in port. Essentially, this was a large propeller mounted in a tube near the bow, and it often eliminates the need for a tugboat. During the 71-72 winter layup in Duluth, Minnesota, she was converted from coal to oil, with the fuel oil tanks replacing the coal bunkers, and a new firefighting system was also installed. Naturally, through 17 years of sailing on the lakes, minor problems were discovered, but there was never anything serious enough that her schedule had to be suspended for any length of time. Nevertheless, because of the nature of her job, there were some accidents. In September of 1969, she went aground near the Sioux Locks and sustained some damage. In April of 1970, she was involved in a minor collision with the SS Hochelaga. In September the same year, she bumped against the lock wall while being maneuvered through the canal at the Sioux. In May of 1973 and in June of 1974, she bumped the lock walls again, but those were considered the rough equivalents to fender benders, and there was no serious or unusual damage. As far as safety equipment goes, for the time period, the Fitzgerald was state-of-the-art. She had two 400-kilowatt steam turbo generators and a 200-kilowatt diesel auxiliary motor to provide electricity. There was also a 30-kilowatt generator that would start automatically for emergency lighting. She carried 3 separate VHF FM 25-watt marine radio telephones on board, 2 of them tied to the ship's main power source, and the third which ran on recharging batteries. One of these radios was a 2-way dial radio telephone, and she also carried a 100-watt AM radio and a 50-watt AM emergency battery-powered radio. Despite all of that, she sank without anybody on board being able to send out a distress call. She was also equipped with a radio direction finder and 2 surface scan radars, but she had no depth gauges or fathometers, which meant that if her crew needed to know the depth of the water beneath her, they had to rely on the old-fashioned way, a length of rope with a lead weight attached to it. She carried 2 lifeboats that could hold 50 people apiece, and she had 2 life rafts that could each hold 25 people. One raft was stowed near the pilot house, the other near the afterdeck, to allow easy access for the entire crew, and they were designed to float free and then inflate when they hit the water. According to regulations, the lifeboats and rafts each had to be capable of carrying all the crew, and because the ship had such widely separated sleeping and working areas, the boats and rafts were spread out on board to enable rapid access. But there's no evidence that the crew of the Fitzgerald were able to reach either the boats or the rafts. Afterwards, only the forward 16 feet of the number 1 lifeboat was found. While number 2 was found in one piece, it was severely damaged, and the general consensus is that the boats tore free of the davits as she sank. During the Coast Guard investigation, many merchant mariners who were asked to testify explained in a variety of ways that trying to use those heavy lifeboats in the kind of storm that engulfed the Fitzgerald would be very difficult. Some pointed out that just launching them in such terrible weather would be nearly impossible. One Great Lakes pilot stated, quote, "I have said, if the damn ship is going down, I would get in my bunk, pull the blankets over my head and say, let her go, because there's no way of launching those boats." The Fitzgerald was also required to carry 83 life preservers, and she carried more than that. She also carried 24 30-inch ring life buoys, 12 of which were equipped with lights. From the evidence, we know there was at least 1 man on board who was wearing a life jacket at the time of the sinking, and it's logical to assume that more of the crew were wearing them considering the weather. Nevertheless, they all went down with the ship. Ships like the Fitzgerald, Great Lakes straight deckers, are very stable when they're loaded correctly, mainly due to the cargo. She usually carried iron ore in the form of taconite pellets, which is a low-grade ore that's been crushed and ground while the iron is oxidized and waste materials are removed. The remaining ore in powder form is then hydrated to about 10% moisture content blended with clay, limestone, and bentonite in order to be rolled up into marble-sized balls about half an inch in diameter. And they're literally only about that big around. The remaining ore is then rolled up into these little balls, and these pellets are then cooked at about 2200 degrees Fahrenheit to 2400 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be 1204 degrees Celsius, and then cooled. Loading the pellets aboard a ship this size required as many as 4.5 hours, while unloading required between 12 and 14 hours. And when she sailed on her last voyage, the Fitzgerald was carrying 26,116 tons of these little pellets, which were loaded aboard at Superior, Wisconsin, and bound for Detroit, Michigan. That was enough iron ore to eventually make about 7,500 automobiles and trucks. Usually it took about 5 days to make a round trip, although she generally loaded at Silver Bay, Minnesota, and then sailed to Toledo, Ohio. In a single sailing season, she made as many as 47 trips. Her last major inspection took place on October 31st, 1975, and revealed damage to 4 of the 21 cargo hatches. There were gouges and cracks found around the hatch openings, but those were considered consistent with routine wear and tear after a long season. The decision was made that she could finish the season and then repairs would be made to those hatches before the 1976 season began. However, investigators would focus on those hatch covers later as a possible contributing issue. William Radigan wrote something in 1977 that I think is important for understanding Great Lakes shipping. And again, he wrote this in 77, quote, "There are 1,500 rolling miles of water from the top of Lake Superior to the toe of Lake Ontario. When Jesuit explorers first came upon Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, they knelt down and tasted the waters, marveling that such mighty inland oceans were fresh instead of salt. In modern times, Champlain's canoe has yielded to ore and grain carriers longer than football fields. During the season of navigation, an average of more than 90 longships a day pass through the Suez Canal, a busier waterway than the Panama and Suez Canals put together. Every 12 minutes, a Great Lakes freighter passes Windmill Point between Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair on the Detroit River. These ships are equipped with the most modern navigational aids. They are supplied with advanced information by the finest weather warning system in the world, and yet they do not always reach port. These great ships sail Great Lakes that can swallow them in one black moment without a trace. Storms exploding across hundreds of miles of open water pile up mountainous seas that strike more swiftly and more often than the deadliest waves on any salty ocean. Before the ship has a chance to recover from the last blow, the next is upon her. The lake's captain has no sea room in which to maneuver. Unlike his saltwater counterpart, he must stay on course throughout the storm, and he must weather the teeth of the gale. It's an old joke, and a true one, on the Great Lakes, that saltwater sailors often become sick on the lakes. The waves on the lakes have a different motion. They are much sharper than ocean waves. They jump and tumble rather than roll and swell. Most of that is because fresh water is less dense than salt water. It's lighter, and the winds can kick it up faster and throw it up higher. When a ship is bound down from fresh water, sails out of Lake Ontario into the St. Lawrence River, she will raise herself 2 or 3 inches as soon as she hits the more buoyant salt water. And it should be pointed out that Le Griffon, the very first European-built ship to sail on the Great Lakes, clear back in 1679, probably sank in Georgian Bay, although the evidence as to location is uncertain. At any rate, the famous French explorer La Salle never saw her again once she sailed past his view. Now, what makes November a risky time to sail are the frequent storms caused by cold Arctic air colliding with warmer air over the lake waters, as those can retain a fair amount of heat through the autumn. As a result, the weather can deteriorate rapidly. There are many sailors who prefer a Lake Superior in a storm if they have to be out at sea at all, because it's the largest of the lakes and there's some room to maneuver. However, others would rather be nearly anywhere else because Lake Superior is up to 1,300 and more feet deep in places, with an average depth of 500 feet, which means that a powerful gale blowing across the lake can build monstrous waves. Lake Erie is the shallowest Great Lake, and the storms kick up waves faster there, but Superior waves can be much larger than those on any other lake. Superior is also the coldest. It generally averages only 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, which means two things. First, a person cannot last long in that water before hypothermia sets in and kills. And second, many times a person's body sinks to the bottom and just stays there, which means that missing sailors are often lost forever. At any rate, it was near the end of the sailing season when the ship set out on her last voyage. Until recently, freighters usually laid up for the winter in late October or early November because of the chances of severe weather, and also because ice would become a problem in the Great Lakes. However, those who run shipping companies often extend the season as long as they can for profits, and it can be a guessing game as to when to cease operations and when to squeeze in that one last run. When the Fitzgerald took on her cargo of taconite pellets at Superior, the 29 men aboard knew there were risks inherent with sailing at that time of the year, but this was the last trip of the season, and soon they would be home until spring. Captain Ernest McSorley had been sailing the Great Lakes for 44 years, ever since he began as an 18-year-old deckhand, and he was looking forward to retirement. But the usual ship's cook could not sail because of health issues, and he was reportedly a bit angry that he wasn't cleared to go. When the ship left Superior on November 9th, 1975, it was a little after 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a sunny, warm Sunday. Detroit was about 700 miles away. A few hours after she sailed, another ship that loaded there, the Wilfred Sykes, also sailed, although her captain, Dudley J. Paquette, believed that a major storm was coming despite the fine weather. And he was right. A low-pressure system had moved across the southwest and slid east over the Oklahoma Panhandle to sweep north over Iowa into Wisconsin, where it collided with a cold blast coming down from northern Canada, and by 7 p.m. that night, the National Weather Service had issued gale warnings for Lake Superior. Just after 7 the next morning, Captain McSorley called the company office to tell them that the ship would arrive at the Sioux Locks later than planned because of the weather. By then, the center of the storm had passed over Marquette, Michigan, and was churning across Lake Superior. In northern Michigan, winds gusting up to 70 miles per hour were recorded. Small boats were smashed against the docks, trees were toppling, schools were closed. People who ventured out on a pier along Lake Michigan were washed into the lake, and while one was rescued, the others were lost. On the Lake Mackinac Bridge, spanning 5 miles of water between upper and lower Michigan, an empty 18-wheeler was knocked over on top of a car, and the authorities decided it was too dangerous to allow further traffic to cross that exposed bridge. All day, the Edmund Fitzgerald worked her way across Lake Superior, sailing northeast. By 1 in the afternoon, she was passing south of Isle Royale. She was not alone. There were several other freighters on the lake, some behind, some ahead. And Captain McSorley was in frequent radio contact with Captain Jesse Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson, an ore carrier that was sailing along with her. The two ships joined up just off Two Harbors, Minnesota, early in the trip after the Anderson departed from there, and they would remain in close company for most of the voyage. About 2 a.m., they radioed each other to discuss the weather and decided to take a more northerly route. The way the wind was blowing, steering north would put them in the lee of the Canadian shore, which would provide some relief. The Wilfred Sykes had already done that. Captain Paquette chose to take the more northerly route when he sailed from Superior. He and his crew listened in to the radio chat between the Fitzgerald and the Anderson. As the Fitzgerald and the Anderson sailed north, beginning around 3 a.m., the Fitzgerald drew ahead since she sailed a bit faster. The winds were blowing steadily at about 48 to 50 miles an hour with harder gusts. For nearly 6 hours, the two ships proceeded without much trouble, although the weather steadily worsened. At 9:53 a.m., the Anderson turned due east, and an hour and 37 minutes later, Captain Cooper steered her southeastward along the Canadian shore. He was cutting corners, so to speak, to keep up with the faster Fitzgerald. The Fitz sailed a bit farther north before also turning. Nevertheless, both ships were running into worsening weather conditions, with the winds and waves continuing to rise. Shortly before noon on November 10th, Captain Cooper reported that the weather seemed to be improving, although the waves were now 10 to 12 feet high. At 12:52 p.m., the Anderson was about 11 miles off Otter Head and changed course slightly to clear the western end of Michipicoten Island by about 2.5 miles. The Fitzgerald was estimated to be 7 to 8 miles ahead then and slightly farther to the east. At 1:40 p.m., Cooper radioed McSorley to discuss the weather again, and because of continuing high waves, Cooper advised that he would ease back a bit toward the west before he passed Michipicoten Island in order to take the waves from astern. McSorley said he would not do likewise since he had already cleared that island. In that radio call, he added that the ship was, quote, rolling some. At 2:45 p.m., the Anderson changed course once again to safely pass the 6-fathom shoals just to the north of Caribou Island. By then, the Fitzgerald was about 16 miles ahead. The two captains both thought the weather had improved somewhat, but the winds kicked up again to nearly 49 miles per hour. It also began to snow heavily, and the men in the pilot house lost sight of the Fitzgerald, although she still showed on their radar screen. With the wind picking up again, the seas began to build worse than ever, and Captain Cooper became increasingly worried about that 6-fathom shoals area. He thought his ship was still perhaps too close to that area of treacherous shallows, so he changed course. The way his ship was rising and falling with the waves, he believed there was a danger she might strike bottom, and he didn't want to take any chances. While no one aboard the Anderson could see the other ship any longer, she was on their radar screen 16 miles ahead and what Cooper later described as a shade to the right or to starboard. To those aboard the Anderson, it looked as if the Fitz passed to the northeast of Caribou Island, but as Cooper testified later, he believes she sailed closer to 6-fathom shoals than he personally wanted to pass. If the Fitz was sailing slightly to starboard of the Anderson when she made her passage, she would have been closer to those shallows. At 3:20 p.m., the Anderson recorded winds at a steady 50 miles an hour and waves up to 16 feet. Her decks were now regularly awash. 10 minutes later, Cooper received a call from McSorley. The captain of the Fitzgerald reported that he, quote, had a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list, meaning the ship was permanently tilted. He said he was slowing down in order that the Anderson could catch up. Cooper asked McSorley if he had the pumps going, and he replied, yes, both of them. The Anderson's radar showed the other ship to be 17 miles ahead and slightly to starboard. Cooper made note of the damage and chose to keep a close eye on the Fitzgerald. McSorley really didn't sound worried, and no one aboard the Anderson's pilot house believed the other ship was in danger. A few minutes later, the Anderson received an emergency broadcast from the U.S. Coast Guard. Ships on Lake Superior were all directed to find safe anchorage. The locks at Sault Ste. Marie were closed due to the storm. The lockmaster reported wind gusts of over 90 miles an hour, and the waves were sweeping over the lock gates. At one point, the ships below the locks were reporting steady winds of just over 80 miles an hour and gusting to more than 94. Sometime between 4 and 4:30, the Edmund Fitzgerald contacted a 490-foot saltwater merchant ship, a Swedish ship called the Avafors, and asked if the Whitefish Point radio beacon and light were operating. The Avafors pilot, Captain Cedric Woodward, replied that he was not receiving the radio beacon and he could not see the light either. A bit later, most of the ships received word that there was a power failure and neither the beacon nor the light were operating. At about 4:10 p.m., the Anderson also received a call from the Fitzgerald. Cooper was temporarily away from the wheelhouse. The first mate took the call. Captain McSorley reported that both of his radars were out and he needed navigational assistance. The Anderson's first mate naturally agreed to help. At 4:52, the Anderson was a beam of and 6 miles off the tip of Caribou Island. On the radar, the Fitzgerald was 14 to 15 miles ahead and a mile to starboard. By then, the winds on the lake were up to 67 miles an hour and the waves were as high as 18 feet. Just after 5 p.m., the Fitzgerald radioed again, asking for its position. The Anderson replied that she was 10.5 miles, 088 degrees T from the Caribou Island light, or 15 miles ahead of the Anderson, and that Whitefish Point was 35 miles ahead of her. About 5:30, the Avafors called the Fitzgerald. Woodard spoke directly to Captain McSorley to tell him that the Whitefish Point light was showing again, but the radio beacon was still out. At one point in the conversation, Woodard heard McSorley shout to someone, "Don't allow nobody on deck." And he thought he heard a reference to a vent. When McSorley resumed the conversation, he told Woodard that the Fitzgerald had a bad list, had lost both radars, and was taking heavy seas over the deck in, quote, "one of the worst seas I have ever been in," unquote. At 6 p.m., the Anderson was 15 miles southeast of Caribou Island and sailing out of the lee of that island when the waves, estimated at 25 feet high, smashed right across the deck, followed by rogue waves estimated at 35 feet high. At 6:10, Cooper went below and left the first mate in charge of the wheelhouse. From what he could see on the radar screen, the Fitzgerald was now to the left of or to port of the Anderson. He called to ask about the apparent drift, and the Fitzgerald reported back that they were maintaining course of 141 degrees T. At 7 p.m., the Anderson again called and reported to the Fitzgerald they were now 10 miles ahead and 15 miles off Crisp Point. 10 minutes later, the Anderson called again to report that there was another vessel approaching about 9 miles ahead of the Fitzgerald. According to the Coast Guard report, the conversation went like this. At 19:10, the mate called the Fitzgerald again and told them there is a target 19 miles ahead of us, so the target is 9 miles on ahead. The Fitzgerald asked, "Well, am I going to clear?" And the mate said, "Yes, he's going to pass to the west of you." Fitzgerald replied, "Well, fine." As the mate started to sign off, he asked, "Oh, by the way, how are you making out with your problem?" And the Fitzgerald replied, "We are holding our own." By then, Cooper returned to the wheelhouse, and the Fitzgerald was 25 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. According to the radar, the Fitzgerald was 9 miles ahead and a little to the east. The snow stopped. Visibility improved greatly, although the wind and waves were still wild. The wheelman aboard the Anderson thought he saw 2 lights off the port bow, one white and one red. He finally decided the red one must actually be coming from shore. He lost track of the white one, and nobody else saw it. Meanwhile, the first mate saw other lights coming from 3 saltwater ships, the Avafors, the Non-Free, and the Benfree, all of them about 17 miles ahead. The Fitzgerald should have been between those ships and the Anderson, but there were no lights to mark her position. Since her radars were reported out, Cooper thought maybe she suffered a power blackout and told the men on watch to look for her. They could see nothing of her. Cooper hurried to the radar screen. He saw those other 3 ships very clearly, but not the Fitzgerald. He and the mate tried to call her. Nothing. Thinking maybe something was wrong with their radio, they called another ship nearby, the William Clay Ford. From where she was anchored in the shelter of Whitefish Point, the Ford could hear them just fine. Cooper then called the Coast Guard at Sault Ste. Marie and was told to switch to another channel and lost contact with them. He then called the Non-Free to see if she had the Fitzgerald on her radar. No. At 8:25, Cooper reached the Coast Guard again and explained that he'd lost the Fitzgerald on radar and he was worried. According to him, the Coast Guard radio operator told him to look for a 16-foot boat missing in the area. 10 minutes later, Cooper called back to say, "I am very concerned about the welfare of the steamer Edmund Fitzgerald. He was right in front of us experiencing a little difficulty. He was taking on a small amount of water, and most of the upbound ships have passed him. I can see no lights as before, and I don't have him on radar. I just hope he didn't take a nosedive," unquote. At that point, the Coast Guard began a search, also informing the Canadian Rescue Center at Trenton, Ontario. But because of the nasty weather, it was not until midnight when the 110-foot Coast Guard cutter Naugatuck finally reached the general area where the ship went down. After the Anderson made it to safety in Whitefish Bay, Captain Cooper chose to sail back out to help with the initial search. Captain Don Erickson and his crew aboard the William Clay Ford also chose to sail back into the storm to search as well. We're still not 100% sure what happened. There have been studies centering on the damaged hatches, some of which were buckled inward, according to the National Transportation Safety Board report. That buckling could have been caused by a combination of massive waves coming aboard and clamps that were not secure, although the Coast Guard investigators disagreed and suggested that the buckling occurred as the ship foundered. The lost vent pipes were also a focus in the rough sea. Either buckling hatches or broken vent pipes could have allowed water to come in, which would have made the ship gradually settle lower and lower in the water. It's also possible she suffered some sort of power failure, which would account for her losing the radars. Maybe her pumps could not keep up with the water coming in. These ships are actually built to flex a little bit in the seas. They're not as rigid. They're built to move a little. And it's possible that as she flexed in the heavy sea, she began to come apart, like the Carl D. Bradley did in Lake Michigan the very year the Fitzgerald was launched. That would account for the report that the fence rail had parted, because as the ship began to break apart, any railing across the upper deck would have broken as a sign that the hull was bending too far. Photographs of the wreck indicate that some rivets failed, and perhaps enough did to eventually break her apart. Combined with the weight of any water that entered the holds, the stress might have been too great, or she might have bottomed out at 6 Fathom Shoals, as Captain Cooper worried, and in the rough weather, she might have hit bottom without her crew or captain even being aware of it, with fatal damage done, which would have allowed water to pour in. Combined with the rough seas flexing her, that damage would have been exacerbated. It appears that, for whatever the reason, she gradually began to break in half. What many believe is that her bow section began to sag with respect to the stern section, and in the heavy seas, the bow section finally just porpoised. It took the nosedive that Cooper was afraid of, and because of its streamlined shape, that forward half of the ship would have just dove right to the bottom. This would explain why she's lying in two pieces. While the forward section plunged down at an abrupt steep angle, the stern section broke free because the engine was still running. It also explains why her crew had no time or chance to radio for help or reach the lifeboats or rafts. The bow section would have gone down very fast, giving the men forward no chance at all. For the men in the stern, there wouldn't have been much time either because water would have rushed in through the massive gap forward. None of the men survived. And although the badly damaged lifeboats and other debris were found, both floating and washed ashore, the remains of the crew have not been recovered. The ship lies in two pieces in about 550 to 560 feet of water. The forward section is upright, the stern section is upside down. The body of at least one man wearing a life jacket was seen by divers in a submersible in 1994, and as a result, there are severe restrictions on diving on that wreck. In 1995, another team went down to retrieve the ship's bell and replace it with a replica. While the leader of a previous expedition to the wreck believes that part of the ship is in U.S. waters and part is in Canadian waters, There has been controversy over access. The Ontario Heritage Act authorizes the Ontario government to require a license to dive, to use side scan sonar, to operate submersibles, or use underwater cameras or any other surveying device within a 500-meter or 1,640-foot radius around the wreck. That permission is very seldom given. She is, after all, a cemetery. She is a watery grave and should be treated with all due respect for those who lost their lives aboard her. And that's it.